Hi, this is John Warley coming to you in these extraordinary times of social distancing and isolation for what I'm calling the coronavirus lectures, sponsored by OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of USC Beaufort. I'm going to try to walk you through some reconstruction in the Beaufort and South Carolina area during the very fateful year of 1865. Since there's no one here to introduce me, I will do that myself by giving you a brief biographical sketch. I'm a graduate of the Citadel, University of Virginia School of Law. I have 5 published novels and one nonfiction uh, volume out on the history of the Citadel. I've also published my most recent book is called The Home Guard, which is historical fiction set in Beaufort during the Civil War. If you have an interest in that era, you might enjoy that. It's available from my website, johnwarley.com. And if you have any questions that arise during the lecture today, you can ask them, but of course, I won't be able to answer unless you email me, which I'm happy to respond to emails, johnwarley@gmail.com. I want to thank Erica Martin and her staff at USC Beaufort for helping me to put this together. The lecture that I gave on Beaufort during the Civil War, which is available on YouTube, was done at USCB's office in Beaufort. But now the college is shuttered like most everything else. So I'm recording this from home. And I hope you get something out of what is going to be essentially a 45 or 50-minute presentation on a truly fascinating time in U.S. history. I also should mention that I wrote the Reconstruction exhibit for the Beaufort History Museum several years back, and that exhibit uh, is available at the old firehouse in downtown Beaufort, now administered as part of the federal Reconstruction effort, and the Park Service can walk you through those exhibits at the old fire station if you're interested. It's probably closed now. I meant to check it before today. I assume that it is closed at the moment, but like everything else, we'll all anticipate the day when it reopens. So let's talk a little bit about Reconstruction in the post Civil War era and begin by defining what Reconstruction is. It's generally considered the process by which the states that seceded were reorganized as part of the Union after the Civil War. And of course, those were the southern states, including South Carolina. The period of time generally considered Reconstruction is 1865 to 1877, although you get a lot of arguments from various academics and historians as to whether or not those are the correct dates. Some say it really should be 1863, starting January 1, 1863. That was the date of the Emancipation Proclamation. On that morning in Beaufort, early in that morning, the proclamation was read at a gathering not far from downtown, attended by some 5,000 people, believed to be perhaps the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation in America. And many people would date the beginning of Reconstruction efforts on that day, because that, as a practical matter, freed the former slaves in Beaufort and the Sea Islands as a result of Lincoln's famous proclamation. But regardless of when you consider it to have started, Reconstruction certainly was in full swing by 1865 because the war ended. As most of us know, the war ended just about the time that Lincoln was assassinated, and Reconstruction very much involves Lincoln's attitude toward Reconstruction and the attitude of his successor, President Andrew Johnson. Lincoln famously said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." And that pretty much characterized Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction. He was not bent on retribution against the South. He wanted to make it, he wanted to have an open arms policy so that if the South took certain steps, they could be reunited with the Union, and was very much against the approach advocated by a lot of the more radical abolitionists that the South needed to be punished. So he favored a speedy reconciliation, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, more or less adopted the same attitudes, perhaps bending too far toward the South, as we will see. Andrew Johnson was a Southerner. There were a lot of misgivings on the part of Northern congressional leaders as to his commitment to Reconstruction, and eventually that led to basically one vote shy of impeachment in the U.S. Senate. But that discussion is for a later day. But you will see during this discussion of 1865 how Johnson began to erode some of the support he might have had in the North for readmitting states to the Union. The radical Republicans, who came along really after they'd seen Johnson's approach for a year or two, the radical Republicans hardened their terms for punishing Southern whites and for greater access to freedmen, which is the term we're using for the formerly enslaved African Americans who were freed by not only the Emancipation Proclamation in Beaufort, but for the entire country with the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. The two visions of reconciliation, Lincoln's with malice toward none and the radical Republicans wanting to punish the South, were essentially fundamentally incompatible, and we'll see which side wins out as we discuss Reconstruction in Beaufort. Let's back up just a little bit, though, to the beginning of 1865 and talk about what was really the beginning of the end for the war in South Carolina and in all of the South. Sherman's famous March to the Sea. Sherman was a fascinating character. William Tecumseh Sherman, known to his friends as Cump. Not many Southerners called him Cump because he wasn't a friend down here. After he burned Atlanta, he moved on in the latter part of 1864 to Savannah, demanded and got the surrender of the city of Savannah, and then could turn his attention north and dedicate the year 1865 to, along with Grant, ending the Civil War. So I've got a map up here which shows you essentially where the thrust of Sherman's march was. He had about 60,000 men. When he first crossed the Savannah River, Sherman sent his right wing north and east through Beaufort toward Charleston, and his left wing west toward Augusta. He did this very intentionally because his aim the entire time was right between the two to Columbia. Sherman really did want to punish Columbia, and his army wanted to exact some revenge for, let's face it, the birthplace of the Civil War. Charleston and Columbia could rightfully claim that title. And so Sherman said he wanted to make Georgia howl, and he certainly made South Carolina howl. But the immediate crossing of the Savannah River was a diversionary tactic. Charleston thought they were going to be invaded and burned by Sherman. Augusta thought they were going to be invaded and burned by Sherman. And the people of Columbia, for whatever reason, adopted a sort of what me worry attitude until it was too late. Columbia was Sherman's goal the entire time. At any rate, he came through Beaufort at some point. His army did, and they camped outside of Beaufort, many thousands of men under the command of General Oliver Howard. And Sherman himself spent exactly one night in Beaufort. Here's Sherman on a famous photograph by Matthew Brady. This is Sherman mounted outside of Atlanta. I'm not sure if that's Atlanta burning in the background or not. The picture wasn't the best, even by Matthew Brady standards, but this is Sherman. An interesting guy, recalled early in his career because he was thought to be crazy. Sherman, at the outbreak of the Civil War, was the headmaster at a military college in Louisiana, which eventually became Louisiana State University. He joined the army, but he exhibited some very erratic behavior, which resulted in his being essentially sent home to recuperate from what in the time might have been called a nervous breakdown. The pressure evidently got to him. And he went home back to Ohio to rest and recuperate, eventually rejoining the army in time to participate in most of the important battles that cemented his relationship with Grant, U.S. Grant. And the combination of Grant and Sherman, of course, was proved victorious in the war. Sherman famously said at some point that Grant had stuck by him when Sherman was crazy, and he stuck by Grant when Grant was drunk. And between the two, they supported each other and had a mutual admiration society. At any rate, Sherman spent, as I said, exactly one night in Beaufort in January of 1865. He spent the night at the Sea Island Hotel, which was at the time the home of General Rufus Saxton, who we'll hear more about. But this is the hotel as it existed in 1861. It would have been Saxon's headquarters at this point. It could not be saved and was eventually torn down, and is today a Best Western hotel right beside the Wells Fargo Bank in downtown Beaufort, if you know the spot. But that's where Sherman spent exactly one night on his trip through Beaufort. Sherman then issued an important historical document called Special Field Order Number 15. This is a somewhat legendary document. Sherman had a problem with his army, and the problem was that newly freed African Americans, the freedmen, did not know what to do with the army coming through lands that they lived in, perhaps for generations. So many of them tagged along with the army. Thousands of them tagged along with the army. Well, the army couldn't ignore them. They had to feed them, they had to clothe them, they had to provide some housing or tents or shelter. And this was a major force weighing on Sherman's logistical um, resources as he tried to move his army north through South Carolina to join Grant in Virginia, which was the goal. So, in order to sort of farm those freedmen out and get them to stay in place and not follow his army, he issued Field Order Number 15. So the islands from Charleston to the south, abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, which took in most of the rice plantations in South Carolina and a lot of them in Georgia, and the country bordering the St. Johns River in Florida. So you're almost down. You're down to Jacksonville now. Are reserved and set apart for the settlement of blacks, now made free by the acts of war and a proclamation of the President of the United States, which, of course, at that time would have been the Emancipation Proclamation. So we're talking about 485,000 acres of land, which is a lot of territory. And now this is going to be set aside for the settlement of black freedmen. At Beaufort, Hilton Head, Savannah, Fernandina, St. Augustine, and Jacksonville, the blacks may remain in their chosen or custom vocations, but on the islands and in the settlements hereafter established, no white person whatever, unless a military officer or soldier detailed for duty, will be permitted to reside. So think about that for a second. Except for a provision we're going to read in a minute, that would have meant that all of Beaufort and all of the Sea Islands would have been off limits to any whites if they weren't Union military officers or soldiers or black. Uh, the charge was given to the three parties named. That would be the Union officers, Union soldiers stationed there for duty, and the freedmen um, under a supervision of an inspector, um, and such others as may choose to settle near them. Each family was to have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable land. We've all heard the expression 40 acres and a mule as being the sort of the reparation that freedmen were to get from the Civil War era, and it didn't turn out so much that way for reasons that we'll see shortly. Brigadier General Saxton, who had resided in Beaufort for pretty much the entire war, was made the inspector of settlements and plantations. And the one provision that I say changed things in Beaufort was that in Beaufort, which had been Union occupied for the entire war, there had been tax sales. And the tax commissioners who organized and carried out those sales were very determined that they would withstand legal challenge after the war. So Sherman did not want to order anything that impaired the titles of those tax sales during the war. But the tax sales had occurred only where the Union had total control, and that was Beaufort and the Sea Islands. So that's why this provision came into being. So let's take a look at Beaufort at the end of the war. So we're talking about April of 1865. All the Union sailors and soldiers who'd occupied Beaufort during the war, most of them were reassigned to Charleston, where there was a bigger logistical problem and security problem. And that left volunteers here in Beaufort and recruited black soldiers as the federal presence. As you may remember, there was famously a black, the first South Carolina infantry of black soldiers organized during the Civil War. And the remnants of those units were left in Beaufort, and they were essentially the Union presence after the war ended. Now we see Northern investors coming down as they had begun to do during the war, what in the South were referred to as carpetbaggers. You had thousands of freedmen, some of whom had purchased land in the tax sales, some of whom came from the mainland because they knew that Beaufort was a protected area and a safe area for them. So Beaufort had this influx of freedmen from the mainland as well. You had some returning antebellum Beaufort families, white families coming back after the Great Skedaddle, trying to reacquire their old lands and estates, and some Union soldiers who'd been here, let's frankly, for 3 or 4 years, liked it, saw an opportunity, and decided to remain. And with that combination, Beaufort's economy began to revive. It was slow, but at least it started. But on the mainland, and here I'm using the area across the uh, Whale Branch. For those of you that know the local geography, the Whale Branch, in some way, places as close as 20 miles away from Beaufort and the Sea Islands, you had a very different story. First of all, Sherman had laid waste to much of it. And of course, he did not lay waste to Beaufort. Why would he? It was occupied by his people. Um, but on the mainland, that was not the case. He laid waste to much of his land, much of the land, buildings, and livestock on his way to Columbia. Uh, he just moved through. He didn't leave any troops to keep law and order. So once Sherman left, law and order, what federal law and order was gone, and the returning Southerners reclaimed their abandoned lands. So here you have a lot of Southerners for whom, frankly, the mainland not far from Beaufort wasn't a very safe place during the war. But now the war's over, the troops have gone, they're going back home, and they intend to take up business as usual when they get back. So you had two very different South Carolinas within the same state. You had the Sea Islands, and I'm including the town of Beaufort, what is now Beaufort County, in that, versus the mainland. So on the Sea Islands, you had a mix of the freedmen, northern whites, some returning white Beaufortonians, uh, and freedmen who owned the land they worked, having purchased it in tax sales, and now being paid a wage to work the land, um, and where they expected to participate in the benefits of freedom. On the mainland, as I say, a radically different story. White Southerners returning to start over what they had been doing when the war started and committed to reestablishing the old order. The fighting had ended, but in important respects, the war had not. These differences inevitably led to violence. I want to talk for a few minutes about a very important organization that was established, interestingly to me, in March of 1865. Now, the war is not over. Remember, Appomattox was April of 1865, So a full month before the war ended, the U.S. government established what it called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Uh, and it's generally just referred to in the history books as the Freedmen's Bureau. Up until this was passed, the military had the assignment of trying to educate freedmen, protect them from any hostile forces, and to feed them and clothe them. And it was not the military's function. The U.S. government wanted to set up a civilian organization that would take care of those needs. It actually superseded Sherman's Field Order 15, which wasn't in effect very long, from January to March of 1865. But the the underlying assumptions of needs of Sherman's Field Order 15 were kept in play. Uh, to to oversee this new Freedmen's Bureau, they tapped General Oliver Howard, who, as I said earlier, had led the right wing of Sherman's army, commanded the right wing in its invasion of South Carolina. And to be his assistant commissioner, they tapped by this time, an old Beaufort hand, General Rufus Saxton, who was the military commander in Beaufort for a good part of the Civil War. And the functions of the Freedmen's Bureau were to establish schools for the freedmen, distribute that 40 acres of land that Sherman had talked about in his Special Order 15, and that land was to go to loyal whites and freedmen. And remember, we're talking about distributing 485,000 acres of land. And the Freedmen's Bureau was also charged with the responsibility to provide food and medical care to the freedmen, and also to resolve contract disputes between whites and freedmen. Now, some people might be curious, and I would be one of them, as to what that was all about. Well, with the abolition of slavery, in order for people who own farms and plantations to get the African American labor they needed to work those farms, and they were still very oriented to cotton, they, rather than ordering a slave to do a block of work called a task, white owners had to contract with those same African Americans to do the work. Those contracts were often written, which was a terrible burden because so many of the freedmen were still illiterate. They would enter into these contracts. Often whites attempted to take advantage of them with the terms of the contracts, and the Freedmen's Bureau was tasked with setting up some courts that would interpret those contracts fairly to both the whites and the freedmen. So these were the responsibilities of the Freedmen's Bureau, and it played an important role in the Reconstruction. I mentioned earlier that at some point, fairly early in his administration, the Congress, Northern representatives and senators became impatient with Johnson's generosity where the South was concerned. And one example of that might be General Saxton's attempt to distribute the land according to the enabling legislation that established the Freedmen's Bureau. Remember, I said a short time ago that one of the challenges that the Freedmen's Bureau was charged with was the distribution of federal lands. Well, General Saxton took that charge very seriously, and he drew up something called Circular 13, which was his well thought out plan of how to distribute federal and abandoned land. And one vivid example occurred on Edisto Island. So the provisions of Circular 13 were implemented there. Freedmen were allowed to settle with the 40 acres of land that had been promised by Sherman's Field Order 15. And even though that field order was technically no longer in force, Saxton made a distribution plan largely based on it, and consistent with what he understood his duties were to carry out the wishes of the Congress and the President as embodied by the Freedmen's Bureau. Well, it didn't turn out so well. As it turned out, Johnson had been listening to some white Southern property owners, people that had a big stake in Edisto Island and in the islands and in the Sea Islands. And they persuaded him that it was a bad idea to distribute all that land to freedmen. And as a result of that, Johnson refused to implement Circular 13, which put the freedmen on Edisto and in other places in the position essentially of squatters on land they thought they were going to ultimately obtain legal title to. Congress got involved. There were some angry recriminations about Johnson in Congress for refusing to let this plan go into effect. And when Congress got involved and passed legislation that would, in effect, have implemented the provisions of Circular 13, Johnson vetoed it. He just refused to go along with it. Ultimately, the Edisto residents who thought they were going to be owning those 40 acres had to be relocated to Port Royal. They did receive a little compensation. They were allowed to harvest their crops for the season. They received a little compensation for any improvements they had made to their property. But their dream of owning that land was denied, and they were allowed to purchase some land in the Port Royal area at $1.50 an acre, which was very affordable. But you can assume that a lot of them did not do that, did not have the wherewithal to do that. So this was just one instance in which Johnson was perceived to be, and actually listening to Southern voices in Reconstruction, as if the South had not lost the war but won it. And gradually, over a period of time, and as we'll hear in the next section, this created a lot of enemies for Johnson, and he didn't need any more of them in Washington, D.C. than he started out with. Now, President Johnson, who of course succeeded to the presidency on Lincoln's assassination, as I said, had an amnesty policy that philosophically was not very different from President Lincoln's stated philosophy. But in the implementation, he turned out to be very different from what Lincoln would have done, and as judged by history, very disappointing in what he did. First, he granted a liberal general amnesty to all the citizens of the seceding states. There were 14 categories of people who were not included in that general amnesty, but those people could acquire their rights of citizenship by a personal appeal to him. So this was a generous policy. I mean, I'm being a little flip here, but you can imagine a white Southerner who'd been a captain in the Confederate Army coming home after Appomattox, going to his land, realizing he needed to be a citizen of the U.S. to enjoy the benefits of citizenship, to vote, uh, and other things. And he's got he writes to Johnson and says, I got home and I found out my favorite mule had died during the war. Well, that's obviously a sort of a frivolous example, but Johnson had a reputation for granting these appeals for almost any reason at all. There are very few of them that he ever turned down. And so what happened was that all these Confederate soldiers and leaders applied to Johnson for an exemption from the 14 limiting factors. He accepted them. So they went back to more or less business as usual, leading their states. We'll see the consequences of that momentarily. Now, in the same way that Johnson had terms for individuals to rejoin the Union, he had terms for the seceding states to rejoin the Union as well. And so one of the first things he did was to appoint a provision in South Carolina was to appoint a provisional governor. It was a man named Benjamin F. Perry. Johnson authorized him to form a government in South Carolina and to hold a constitutional convention. Well, Perry, probably because he feared for his personal safety, appointed ex-Confederates and Southern sympathizers under the power awarded him by Johnson. And that in turn produced a convention that was determined to restore the old order, by which I mean the antebellum Southern order. Uh, Johnson's requirements for a Southern state, to re-enter the Union, South Carolina or any of the other seceding states, was they had to void the Ordinance of Secession, they had to end slavery, and they had to repudiate Confederate debt, were the three main requirements that Johnson imposed for a state to rejoin the Union. So let's see what South Carolina did. Did they obey Johnson's terms? Not really. They repealed the Ordinance of Secession, but they didn't nullify it. Now, that might appear to be a distinction without a difference, but to the men who passed this, that participated in this constitutional convention, it was an important difference. They refused to abolish slavery legally, but declared that it had been ended by an edict of the U.S. government. They didn't address the Confederate debt issue at all. They did adopt a couple of progressive policies in this convention. They provided for a popular election of the governor. They eliminated the requirement that office holders be property owners. Most people could agree that those two provisions were reasonable and forward thinking. Something that is with us today is before this change, there was no Beaufort County. There were parishes around around the Low Country, St. Luke's Parish, um, other parishes. This eliminated that system and brought Beaufort County into existence, which of course is what we have today. And this new constitution, which I'm sure these organizers were very proud of, was ratified by the same people who drafted it. Sort of no-brainer there. So, with ex-Confederates and secessionists organizing the new government, surprise, surprise, they ended up being elected to the South Carolina House and Senate, the General Assembly of South Carolina. Well, now we're late into the year 1865. The 13th Amendment has been adopted, abolishing slavery in the United States. Uh, the General Assembly met late in the year, and they had to ratify the 13th Amendment in order to rejoin the Union, which they did. They enacted the famous Black Codes. These were these were laws passed by this first assembly that essentially legalized segregation in South Carolina. It imposed a system that would later be known as apartheid. Um, and so here it is, a return to the old antebellum order. They It wasn't called slavery, but it basically functioned as slavery. These didn't last long. They were immediately declared void by General Daniel Sickles, who was the federal commander in Beaufort. But their passage at all shows just how unreconstructed the government of South Carolina was heading into the year 1866. So I don't know about you, but I smell some trouble brewing with a conquered territory like South Carolina, a conquered state militarily, still carrying on the war, essentially. So, speaking now specifically about Beaufort and the Sea Islands, what did they want? Uh, because a large percentage of them were freedmen, their priorities were land. They wanted to own the land they had worked for generations. The freedmen wanted a voice in the government that controlled their lives, and that meant the right to vote. They were thirsty for education. The Freedmen's Bureau challenge of establishing schools for African Americans was met with an outpouring of uh, freedmen and freedmen's children who wanted to go to school and to learn. Recall that prior to the Civil War, there were no schools for African Americans. It was illegal to teach an African American to vote, to read. And so education was critical for them. They wanted freedom from fear. Now, in Beaufort and the Sea Islands, that was a little abstract because of the Union presence during the war. But once the Union soldiers left, the blacks in Beaufort and on the Sea Islands began arming themselves because they feared for their personal safety. For one thing, the whites were returning, and they weren't sure that their old masters wouldn't try to regain their superior positions through violence and intimidation, and they wanted to be protected from that. So they began arming themselves, which was not a good sign for what was coming in 1866 and beyond. Uh, what did they get? I listed the things they wanted: land, the vote, education, and freedom from fear. What did they get? Well, to find that out, we really need to go into 1866, which will be the subject of the next lecture. And it starts off with lots of important events and concludes the same way. So I think you'll be very interested in this next chapter, and I hope you'll join me for that. Thanks for your attention today, and everybody stay safe, and I'll see you next time.